In tonight's episode, we are traveling into the heart of India, where devotion and dread have always walked side by side. There are 3 stories tonight, and this is one of them. This one is whispered in temples, in villages, and even in city streets, where her image is painted on cracked walls and clay idols. Everyone knows her name. Everyone fears her shadow. She is called Kali. To some, the protective mother. To others, the blood drinker. Black-skinned, with eyes that blaze like fire. Her garland is not of flowers, but of severed heads. Her tongue drips red, a river that never runs dry. Pilgrims come to her with flowers and incense, but behind those offerings lies something darker. Rituals that once demanded the throat of a goat, or worse. Sacrifices that were meant to feed her hunger. What happens when worship is built on fear? What happens when devotion tastes of blood? Stay close. This story is not about good or evil. It is about the goddess who stands over corpses and still demands to be remembered. The goddess of time, destruction, and rebirth has always been more than an image on temple walls. In the crowded streets of Kolkata, her eyes look down from roadside shrines, smeared with vermilion and smoke. In remote villages, her name is muttered like a shield, as if even speaking it could hold back death itself. This is Kali. She is worshipped across India as a mother, but she is not a gentle one. Her form is terror itself, and yet it is through that terror that people believe protection can be found. Black skin, wild hair, a garland strung with human heads. She stands with one foot upon a corpse, her tongue hanging red and wet, thirsting. This image is not hidden in shadows, but displayed openly in temples alive with incense and drumbeats. Children see it. The old bow to it. The faithful smear ash upon their foreheads and whisper for her mercy. And in the thick summer heat, when the air is heavy with dust and sweat, her presence feels almost alive. Her worship has always been a paradox. On one side, the mother who protects. On the other, the destroyer who must be appeased. Festivals in her honor erupt with colors, music, and dance, yet beneath the celebration runs a current of unease. The rituals once called for blood, goats brought to the altar, chickens held in trembling hands, the sharp cry of an animal silenced in an instant. In ancient times, the whispers tell of even darker offerings, sacrifices that crossed the boundary between animal and human. The place most haunted by her presence is Calahhat, a temple older than memory, its stone floors slick with the footsteps of millions who come to bow before her. The priests chant in rhythms that sound like heartbeats. The clang of bells echoes against walls blackened with smoke, and in the courtyards, sacrifices still spill red upon the stone. The faithful believe that to look into her eyes is to see truth stripped bare. Life and death, creation and destruction, locked together in an endless embrace. For those who come seeking her favor, the question has always been the same. How much blood is enough? How much fear does she require? And what happens to those who give too little or too much? It began with a night of storm. The monsoon winds screamed through the narrow lanes, leading to Calahhat, carrying with them the stench of wet earth and something sharper, like iron. Pilgrims had gathered, clutching baskets of flowers and sweets, but the air was not sweet. It was heavy, pressed down by drums and the cries of animals waiting in the courtyard. At first, it was only a rumor. A boy swore he saw the idol's tongue move, glistening in the candlelight as though it had just tasted something fresh. Others dismissed him, but he would not be silenced. He said he felt her eyes follow him, burning holes through his chest. Priests tried to calm the crowd, yet the unease only deepened. Then came the offering. A goat, black as midnight, dragged to the stone slab. Its cries filled the courtyard, high and desperate. The crowd leaned forward, a sea of bodies pressing against one another, waiting for the blade. The priest's hands trembled. He raised the knife, but in that instant, the animal collapsed without the cut. its neck twisted as if snapped by an unseen hand. Blood poured anyway, staining the stones. The people gasped, some fleeing, others falling to their knees in awe. Whispers spread faster than the rain. Had Kali herself taken the sacrifice, or had something far worse been invited into her temple? The boy's voice rose again, thin and frantic. He pointed toward the idol. Her garland of severed heads seemed to shift, mouths opening in silent screams. The priest struck his bell in panic, but the sound cracked, as though the metal itself had split. The night pressed in tighter. The flames of the oil lamps shivered low, stretching the shadows across the courtyard until they swallowed the walls. A woman fainted. Someone claimed to hear laughter, low, guttural, vibrating from the stone itself. Still, the people did not leave. Fear had rooted them to the ground. They believed they were watching a sign, an omen, but no one could say if it was a promise of protection or a warning of destruction yet to come. The next nights did not bring peace. Word of the sacrifice that fell without a blade spread beyond the temple walls, drawing more pilgrims, more skeptics, more desperate souls who wanted to witness what they called the breathing of the goddess. They came with garlands of marigolds, with bowls of milk, with trembling hands carrying animals bound in rope. The courtyard grew crowded, thick with smoke and sweat, a furnace of devotion and dread. Then came the second event. A young woman, her face streaked with ash, swore that Kali had whispered in her ear. She said the voice was not her own, that it clawed inside her skull like fire. "Feed me," it said. "More, more." She screamed and the crowd turned. Her body convulsed, limbs stiff, mouth open too wide. When she collapsed, her tongue was red though she had eaten nothing. The priests tried to control it, striking bells, chanting mantras until their throats cracked, but the atmosphere only thickened. Some said the ground itself pulsed like a heartbeat. Others claimed they saw shapes moving in the smoke, headless bodies, skeletal forms, animal faces staring through the haze. The Yoginis, Kali's attendants, were said to arrive when blood was not enough. Now people believed they had come. Not everyone agreed. A foreign traveler who stood in the courtyard laughed bitterly, calling it superstition, a fever of the mind. He mocked the faithful, saying the goat's fall was a trick, the woman's fit a sickness. But when he spoke, the crowd recoiled. His words carried weightless in the air, yet the shadows around him lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward his feet. Someone whispered that Kali does not forgive mockery. Warnings came too. An old woman, her hair matted like rope, hissed to the pilgrims that blood never ends hunger, it only stirs it. "She will take what you love," the woman croaked. "Not what you offer." Few listened. Many shoved her aside, desperate to push their offerings to the altar. Every night, the air grew heavier. The sacrifices continued, but the unease only deepened. Children woke screaming, seeing eyes in the dark corners of their homes. Men walked in dreams, carrying knives without memory of why. Even the priests began to falter. One was found kneeling before the idol long after the courtyard had emptied, his forehead beaten bloody against the stone floor, whispering apologies to a mother who does not forgive. Still watching, still waiting. The people began to ask the question in silence, with lips pressed tight. What happens when the goddess herself answers? And if she does, who will survive the reply? It came with a night so black that even the stars seemed swallowed whole. The temple burned with firelight, its shadows leaping like living things. The drums pounded faster, as if trying to outrun the fear in every chest. Tonight was the great festival, the night of the mother's dance, when the boundaries between the living and the dead were said to tremble thin. The crowd gathered close, thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, faces painted with ash and vermilion. The air tasted of incense and blood, a sharp copper tang that clung to the tongue. On the altar lay a line of animals waiting their fate. The priests chanted until their voices cracked, striking bells in fevered rhythm, their eyes shining wild. And then, without warning, the flames dipped low. The courtyard plunged into a shivering gloom. When the fire rose again, the idol seemed changed. Her eyes glowed brighter, her garland swayed though no wind moved, and her long red tongue gleamed wet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some dropped flat to the ground, pressing their foreheads into the stone. Others screamed and fled into the night. The sacrifices began, one after another, but something was wrong. Each cut poured too much blood, rivers pooling across the stone floor, spreading faster than the priests could clean. The smell grew suffocating, hot and metallic, coating the lungs. A goat's severed head rolled from the altar and landed at the feet of a child, its eyes still blinking. The boy's scream pierced through the chanting, and for a heartbeat, silence fell. Then the temple roared alive. The drums thundered without hands, striking them, shaking the walls. The garland of heads on Kali's neck began to move, jaws opening and closing, teeth grinding in a chorus of agony. The idol's tongue extended, impossibly long, dragging across the air as if tasting the fear itself. A priest collapsed, blood streaming from his nose and ears. Another tore his robes and wailed, "She is here! She is here!" The crowd surged in panic, some begging for mercy, others pushing toward the altar as though offering themselves would end it. In the chaos, the young woman who had once heard her whisper rose again. Her eyes rolled white, her voice a guttural growl, not her own. "Mother drinks," she said. "Mother never stops." The ground trembled, oil lamps shattered, and for a moment it felt as if the goddess had stepped down from her pedestal, as if stone had become flesh. Those who looked swore they saw her move, one foot pressing deeper into the corpse beneath her, her gaze sweeping over the living with hunger unmasked. In that moment, there was no mother, no protector, no goddess of mercy. There was only Kali, the blood drinker, and her feast had begun. The aftermath was whispered about for years, yet even those who were there could never fully agree on what they had seen. Some swore that Kali had truly stepped down from her pedestal, that her shadow had walked among them, taller than the temple walls. Others said it was mass hysteria, the fever of blood and smoke twisting their minds. But one truth remained certain. Something happened that night which left the people changed forever. When the priests returned at dawn, they found the courtyard drenched, the stones dark and slick. No rain had fallen, yet the smell of blood lingered in the heat, thick and undeniable. Animals brought for sacrifice were gone, vanished without trace, as though swallowed by the earth itself. And in the center of the temple, the idol's tongue shone clean, not a drop of red upon it, as if it had licked itself pure. The young woman who had spoken in the goddess's voice was nowhere to be found. Some believed she had been taken, chosen as the mouthpiece of the divine. Others whispered she had been devoured, body and soul, offered without ceremony. Her family never saw her again. It was only then that the old woman's warning began to echo in frightened hearts. Blood never ends hunger, it only stirs it. The people remembered her words and shuddered. Because in the nights that followed, the strange events did not stop. Doors creaked open with no hand to push them. Drums beat faintly in the distance, though no festival was near. Children woke with tongues bitten raw, as though something had tried to taste through them. The faithful told themselves it was a blessing, that the goddess was alive and present, walking with them, demanding devotion. But others began to avoid the temple, afraid that every prayer spoken aloud was an invitation for her to listen too closely. The revelations spread quietly, spoken in trembling voices, never shouted. Kali was not just an idol of stone or a mother to be adored. She was hunger without end. A force that could not be silenced by chants or offerings. She had been given blood, and she had remembered the taste. And if she chose to return again, nothing, not priests, not chants, not the faith of millions, would stand in her way. The temple never closed, but the people who entered it began to change. They walked differently, heads lowered, eyes darting at shadows that stretched too long. Merchants still sold garlands and sweets by the gates, yet their voices carried no joy, only unease. Mothers tugged children closer, warning them not to look too long at the idol, but the children already knew. They whispered to each other in the dark, swearing they saw her tongue move when no one was watching. Some nights, the drums could be heard far beyond Calahhat. No festival, no ritual, only the steady, pulsing rhythm, as if the earth itself was beating with her heart. And with the drums came dreams. Families awoke to find their sons and daughters wandering the streets barefoot, drawn toward the temple with blank eyes. Some returned home, some did not. The old woman who had once warned the crowd was found dead at the edge of the river. Her body was marked with deep red smears across her chest, as though a tongue had dragged itself over her flesh. No one claimed her remains. No one dared. By then, the story was too large to contain. Some said Kali had never left that night, that she still lingered, feeding on the fear she had sown. Others believed it was not Kali at all, but something darker masquerading as her, twisting devotion into doom. The priests denied everything, but their eyes betrayed them. They knew more than they spoke. And so the people of Kolkata learned to live with it, with the taste of iron in the air, with the silent weight of eyes upon them, always watching, always waiting. A mother, yes, but one who stood upon corpses. Even now, pilgrims still come. They bow, they chant, they leave their offerings. But none can shake the final question that hangs in the silence of the temple. When a goddess remembers the taste of blood, how long until she comes to drink again? Thank you. Now we step from the crimson altar of Kali into the shadows that surround her. There are 3 stories tonight, and what you've just heard is only the first, for Kali was never truly alone. In the ancient texts, in the ruins of forgotten shrines, there are whispers of her wild companions, a sisterhood of terror that even the faithful dared not ignore. They were called the Yoginis, 64 goddesses, each one more dreadful than the last. Animal-headed, winged, skeletal, some without faces at all. They were said to circle their mother in rings of stone, hungry for the same blood, the same fear. To honor Kali was to fear them too, because turning away from the Yoginis meant curses, sickness, and sometimes death itself. Across India and Nepal, their temples still stand. Lonely circles of stone open to the sky where wind cuts like a blade and the air tastes wrong. Locals avoid them, whispering of nights when the Yoginis still dance, waiting for the living to stumble too close. Now, let us leave the smoke of Calahhat and step into those circles, to the shrines where 64 shadows still linger, watching, waiting, hungering. This is the story of the cannibal goddesses. Now we step from the crimson altar of Kali into the shadows that surround her. There are 3 stories tonight, and what you've just heard is only the first. For Kali was never truly alone. In the ancient texts, in the ruins of forgotten shrines, there are whispers of her wild companions, a sisterhood of terror that even the faithful dared not ignore. They were called the Yoginis, 64 goddesses, each one more dreadful than the last. Animal-headed, winged, skeletal, some without faces at all. They were said to circle their mother in rings of stone, hungry for the same blood, the same fear. To honor Kali was to fear them too, because turning away from the Yoginis meant curses, sickness, and sometimes death itself. Across India and Nepal, their temples still stand. Lonely circles of stone, open to the sky, where wind cuts like a blade and the air tastes wrong. Locals avoid them, whispering of nights when the Yoginis still dance, waiting for the living to stumble too close. Now, let us leave the smoke of Calahhat and step into those circles, to the shrines where 64 shadows still linger, watching, waiting, hungering. This is the story of the cannibal goddesses. They were never meant to be forgotten, though most people today do not even know their names. The Yoginis, 64 fierce goddesses, were once feared as much as they were revered. Not gentle consorts, not benevolent guardians, but a storm of female divinities who thrived on chaos, blood, and possession. Each had a form that twisted the human into something uncanny: wings where arms should be, skulls for faces, fangs in place of teeth, eyes that burned with hunger. To see them carved in stone was to be reminded that divinity could just as easily consume as it could protect. Their worship was not practiced in the grand temples of the cities. No, the Yoginis demanded isolation. Their shrines were built in circles of stone, often on hilltops or deep forests, always beneath an open sky. Unlike enclosed temples where the gods were housed, these were places without roofs, exposed to the elements, as though the heavens themselves had to witness the rites. Many of these circles still stand in Orissa, in Madhya Pradesh, even in the far reaches of Nepal, their stones cracked but their presence undiminished. Step into one, and the silence is overwhelming. Birds do not sing. Even the wind seems to hesitate. Why were these shrines so feared? Because the Yoginis were said to dance at night, circling endlessly, calling the souls of the living into their ring. Devotees once believed that if you honored them with offerings of blood, they could grant visions, strength, even protection from enemies. But ignore them, or worse, mock them, and their vengeance was swift. Disease, madness, and sudden death were all attributed to the insult of passing their circle without respect. Historical accounts describe rituals so strange they border on nightmare. Naked initiates covered themselves in ash, whispering incantations under the moon. Blood, animal, sometimes human, was spilled onto the stone, soaking the earth. The Yoginis were said to descend, invisible yet palpable, their presence thick as smoke. In some sects, those chosen by the Yoginis would fall into trances, their bodies contorted, their voices taken by the goddesses themselves. To be a vessel was both an honor and a death sentence, for no one could live long after serving as their mouthpiece. Even now, villagers who live near these ruined circles walk the long way around. They say the stones hum at dusk, a sound low and vibrating, like teeth grinding against bone. Children are told never to play near them. Travelers are warned to avoid camping too close, and yet the ruins remain, crumbling but alive, a reminder that the Yoginis may not have left at all. They may simply be waiting, still circling in the dark, hungry for the blood they were once promised. It began with a traveler who refused to listen, a wandering ascetic, draped in saffron cloth, carrying nothing but a bowl and a staff. He had heard of the ruined shrine on the edge of the forest and laughed at the villagers' fear. To him, the Yoginis were myths, stories meant to keep children from wandering too far. He wanted to prove their weakness by walking into their circle at dusk, chanting his own prayers, daring them to show themselves. The villagers begged him not to go. They warned him of curses, of the sickness that clung to those who mocked the Yoginis. He only laughed harder. If they exist, he said, they are mine to command. For what are goddesses without worshippers? And with that he stepped into the ring of stone, his bare feet sinking into earth that felt too soft, too wet, as though something beneath was rotting. The first sign came quickly. The air grew heavy, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. The saffron cloth clung damp to his body, though no rain had fallen. He struck his staff against the ground in defiance, and the sound did not echo. It was swallowed, as if the circle itself had eaten it. Then the birds fell silent. Not one cry from the jungle, not one rustle of wing. The forest, alive only moments ago, became still as death. He felt a crawling across his back, like the prickling of 1,000 unseen eyes. When he turned, the stones seemed closer, their edges shifting, as though the circle had tightened. Whispers rose from nowhere. Female voices, dozens of them, low and guttural, then high and sharp, weaving together in a chant that had no words but still carried meaning. His body trembled, his tongue twisted in his mouth, trying to form syllables that were not his own. The voices wanted to speak through him. He spat into the earth, shouting a prayer to another god, a god of order and light. For a moment, the whispers stilled. But then came the second sign. The shadows at his feet lengthened, spreading like spilled ink, merging into the shape of bodies, headless, winged, animal-faced. They danced around him, faster and faster, though no wind stirred the trees. The ascetic dropped his staff. His legs buckled. He screamed that he had not come to serve, only to test, only to mock. But the Yoginis were listening now. They had been called, and they were hungry. The next days brought terror that spread beyond the circle. Villagers whispered that the ascetic had not returned, though some swore they still heard his voice at night. Not speaking, but chanting, a hollow sound drifting through the trees. Those who followed it never came back. By the third night, the people locked their doors before dusk, leaving offerings of milk and flowers at the forest's edge, hoping it would be enough to keep the Yoginis away. Then came the second event. A herdsman searching for a lost calf wandered too close to the ruined shrine. He did not enter, but he saw movement inside. Dozens of shadows swirled in the circle, pale limbs flashing against the moonlight. At their center, the ascetic stood, his body stiff, his eyes white, his tongue lolling from his mouth as if too long for his own skull. His saffron cloth was gone. His skin was marked in streaks of red, handprints pressed into him from every direction. The herdsman ran, but he swore the shadows followed, reaching across the forest floor like fingers grasping his heels. When he returned to the village, gasping and wild-eyed, the elders listened in silence. They did not question him. They knew the Yoginis had claimed their vessel. The old stories returned to memory, how the 64 sisters would take a body, hollow it out, and wear it as their mask until it broke. The warnings multiplied. Cattle sickened overnight, their bellies bloated, tongues blackened. Children cried of women with bird wings circling above their beds. A fever spread through the village, leaving the strong too weak to rise, and the priests declared it punishment for failing to appease the Yoginis. Yet, when they tried to perform rites, their chants faltered, their mouths dried, as if the goddesses themselves silenced them. Fear turned to desperation. Families abandoned homes, fleeing into other villages, carrying the story with them like a plague, and wherever the tale spread, unease followed. People avoided old stone circles, no matter how crumbled, no matter how forgotten. They said the Yoginis walked again, and to step inside their dance was to surrender yourself to them. But even those who avoided the forest could not escape. For some nights, the chanting carried on the wind, low and ceaseless, a rhythm of feet stamping upon earth. No matter how far they ran, the villagers could still hear it, circling, circling, circling. It was on the night of the new moon that the horror reached its peak. The forest lay in perfect darkness, a silence so deep it seemed carved into the world. The ruined circle of stone glowed faintly, as though each block of granite had been lit from within. No torches, no lamps, only the stones themselves pulsing with a sickly light. A group of men, brave or foolish, crept from the village carrying offerings, bowls of rice, garlands of flowers, even the trembling body of a goat. They believed the Yoginis demanded a feast and that only fresh blood would sate them. But as they stepped into the circle, their offerings were struck aside. The garlands withered instantly, the rice blackened, the goat screamed and collapsed, its throat split by no blade. The men froze, terror rooting them where they stood. Then the air split open. A sound rose from the earth, half scream, half laughter, as if 64 throats sang together in hunger. The shadows thickened, forming shapes unmistakable now. Women with skeletal faces, women with wings of bone, women without heads, and women whose eyes glowed like burning coals. They circled the men, faster and faster, until the ground itself trembled. At the center stood the ascetic, no longer a man, but a puppet. His skin sagged, stretched too thin, his limbs jerking unnaturally with each turn of the circle. His mouth opened wider than it should have, and from his throat poured a voice that was not his. We drink, we feast, we return. The men tried to flee, but the Yoginis closed in. Clawed hands tore at their bodies, dragging them down. Their screams melted into the chant, becoming part of the rhythm. The goat's body was lifted, ripped apart, devoured in moments. Blood sprayed across the stones, soaking them until the sickly light turned crimson. Villagers who watched from the trees saw the circle come alive with a frenzy of motion, figures leaping, dancing, tearing, devouring. And when the moon finally rose pale above the forest, the circle was silent once more. The men were gone. No bones, no scraps of cloth, nothing. Only the stones remained, slick with blood that did not fade with dawn. From that night, no one entered the forest again. The path to the circle grew over with weeds, but the fear remained. For those who had glimpsed it swore they saw the 64 sisters in their full hunger, their dance a feast of flesh and soul. And they understood, the Yoginis had never vanished. They had only been waiting for the world to remember their taste. When the sun rose after that night, the forest seemed unchanged, but the people knew better. The air clung heavy, carrying the copper tang of blood, though no body remained. Birds did not return to the trees. Dogs barked at the wind and refused to go near the shrine. The villagers gathered in silence, eyes fixed on the direction of the ruins, but no one dared to walk the path again. Stories spread quickly, weaving themselves into warnings. Farmers said their plows turned up bones, though none had been buried there. Travelers whispered of seeing women on the ridgeline at dusk, winged figures, headless figures, watching, then vanishing into the stone. Some swore they heard the sound of chewing in the dark, slow and wet, though nothing was there. The priests tried to explain it away. They said the Yoginis were never real, that the visions were born of fear, yet even they avoided the forest at night. Their denials carried no weight, for their own faces were pale and sleepless. The sickness in the village lingered, fevers that would not break, children who wasted away though no illness could be found. Families began to whisper that this was not punishment for forgotten offerings. It was the touch of the Yoginis themselves, reaching out from their circle to feed. What unsettled the villagers most was the silence of the stones. Once, those ruins had hummed faintly at dusk, a vibration felt in the bones. After the night of blood, the sound stopped. The stones no longer spoke, and this absence terrified more than the noise. It was as if the sisters had left the shrine entirely, free now to wander wherever they pleased. And yet the evidence remained. Cattle vanished from their pens, crops wilted in neat circles as if pressed down by unseen feet. Strangers who dared to pass through the forest never reached their destination. Their belongings were found scattered at the roadside, but of their bodies there was nothing. The realization came slowly, spoken first by the old and then by everyone who dared to admit it. The Yoginis had been worshipped not because they needed devotion, but because people needed protection from them. The rituals, the blood, the sacrifices, all had been bargains. And now those bargains were broken. The Yoginis were no longer contained by their stone ring. They had been fed, they had remembered, and nothing could bind them again. The villagers never rebuilt what was lost. Abandoned homes crumbled into dust, fields grew wild, and the path to the forest disappeared beneath thorns. But the fear remained, carried like an heirloom from one generation to the next. Children were told never to wander at night. Strangers were warned to avoid the old stone circles scattered across India and Nepal. "They still dance there," the elders whispered. "They still hunger." Travelers passing near those ruins claimed the same visions. Pale women circling under the moon. Figures without faces, skeletal jaws grinding, wings beating without sound. Some said they heard chanting, dozens of voices blending into one, growing louder until it filled the skull. A few admitted they followed the sound, just for a moment, and when they turned back they had lost hours, sometimes days, as if the Yoginis had stolen time itself. The priests who once denied their presence eventually changed their tune. Quietly, without ceremony, they began leaving offerings again. A bowl of milk poured onto the ground. A goat tethered at the forest edge. Never in the circle itself, only close enough to be found, and always with eyes averted, for they knew the Yoginis did not forgive being seen. Even now, some shrines remain, lonely rings of stone crumbling under the weight of centuries, open to the sky. Locals walk wide around them, whispering that the sisters still wait there, circling unseen. Archaeologists who dared to study them returned with strange illnesses, dreams of blood and flight, and a hollow look in their eyes that never left. The story of the Yoginis ends as it always began, with silence. A silence too deep, too heavy, as if 64 mouths pressed close, listening, waiting. The people remember what the old text said. These were not goddesses of comfort. They were hunger made divine. And so the question lingers, unspoken but heavy in every village that lives near a ruined circle. If the Yoginis have tasted once again, if their feast has already begun, how long until they dance beyond the stones and step fully into the world of the living? Thank you. Now we move from the circles of stone where the Yoginis dance to the waters that never sleep. There are 3 stories tonight, and what you have heard is only the second. The blood-hungry sisters remind us that fear does not vanish when temples fall. It only changes shape. And in India, in Nepal, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, that shape is serpentine. They are called the Naga. To some, protectors of rivers, bringers of rain, guardians of fertility. But behind that mask of blessing lies their darker truth. Serpents vast enough to coil around villages, eyes glowing from beneath the flood, mouths wide enough to swallow a man whole. In ages past, people spoke of brides taken by the river, sacrifices meant to soothe the hunger of the water gods. Even now, the old rites survive. Milk poured into snake holes, incense burning at riverbanks, offerings whispered with trembling voices, because everyone knows what happens if the Naga are denied. They rise, they drown, they devour. So let us leave the ruins of stone and step into the current, where shadows twist just below the surface. This is the story of the drowning serpents. The rivers of India and Southeast Asia have always been more than water. They are lifelines, carrying fertility to the fields, linking villages by trade, feeding entire kingdoms. But beneath their glistening surfaces runs something older than human memory. The people call them Naga, serpents vast and sacred, gods of the undercurrent, guardians of the waters. In temples carved with coils of stone, their forms are everywhere, half human, half snake, crowned with jewels, eyes unblinking. Yet no image, no carving, could capture the terror of meeting them in their true form. For the Naga are not simply protectors, they are destroyers as well. Legends say they can rise from the depths to flood entire villages, swallowing fields and homes alike. Their hunger was not only for water but for flesh, for brides taken from their families and given to the river. Old songs still speak of young women dressed in red, led weeping to the banks, their bangles jingling one last time before the currents closed over them. It was not called murder. It was called devotion, an offering to serpents that demanded loyalty through sacrifice. The rituals to honor them were woven into daily life, milk poured into the mouths of snake holes, incense offered at the edges of wells, flowers cast into rivers at dawn. These acts were not symbolic. They were desperate bargains, meant to soothe the serpents so they would not rise in wrath. Monsoon storms were seen as their breath, floods as their anger, droughts as their withdrawal. To survive meant to keep the Naga appeased. Even now, the traces remain. In rural villages of Assam, Bengal, Cambodia, Laos and Thailand, people still leave bowls of milk in the dust where snakes slip unseen. Children are warned never to harm a serpent, for it may be a Naga in disguise, watching, judging, waiting. Some shrines remain active, tucked in jungles where the stone has been eaten by moss. Yet the offerings keep coming, laid quietly in the night. There is beauty in their myth, yes, serpents as guardians of rivers, fertility, and life. But there is also dread, because the water that feeds can just as easily drown. Every villager who bows to a river knows this truth. They do not worship out of love. They worship because the Naga are always near, coiled in the dark current, listening for the sound of neglect. To live beside the river is to live with the serpent, and the serpent, once stirred, never returns to sleep willingly. It began with a river that would not calm. The rains had ended weeks before, yet the water still rose, inch by inch, swallowing the fields at its edges. At first, the villagers called it bad luck, a quirk of the season. But soon the current turned strange, eddies circling without wind, whirlpools forming where none had ever been. Fishermen who cast their nets swore the river pulled back at them, as though something below was breathing, drawing the water into its lungs. One morning, a farmer found cattle drowned at the riverbank. Their bodies were intact, but their eyes were gone, sockets hollow and clean. The elders whispered that the Naga had taken their tribute, blood for strength, flesh for hunger. The people grew restless. They remembered the old ways, the ones their grandparents had spoken of in half-whispered tones. Milk and flowers were no longer enough. When the waters rose without reason, it was not an accident. It was a warning. That night, a boy swore he saw something moving beneath the surface. Not a fish, not a log, but coils larger than any boat, scales glimmering in the moonlight before vanishing again. He ran through the village screaming, and though no one believed him outright, no one dared fetch water alone after dark. The priests held council by the river, their chants echoing over the current. But the sound did not carry far. It seemed smothered, pressed down into silence. Then came the smell, sharp and metallic, like iron. The villagers gathered at the bank, staring into the water, and they saw it for themselves. Bubbles rose, wide and slow, and with them came a red stain that spread across the surface. Not fish blood, not animal, something larger, deeper, something human. The women began to wail. The men gripped their torches tighter, though no flame could ward off a god. And in the churn of the current, the people heard it clearly for the first time. A hiss. Long, low, endless. The hiss of something vast just beneath their feet. The Naga had awoken, and they were waiting. The days that followed blurred into fear. The river refused to retreat, creeping higher into the fields, swallowing rice stalks whole. The villagers built barriers of stone and mud, but each wall collapsed as if struck from below. Some swore they saw coils rise in the distance, cresting just above the surface before sinking back down. Others claimed the water itself moved like a body, rolling with purpose rather than tide. Then came the second event. A girl was taken. She had gone to the bank with her mother to fill a clay pot. The mother's scream split the air, but by the time others arrived, there was nothing, only the pot spinning in the current and bubbles breaking the surface where she had stood. The villagers searched the banks for hours, but the water showed no trace. The elders did not search at all. They lowered their heads and said only, "The Naga has claimed his bride." Panic spread through the village. Some wanted to flee inland, away from the cursed river. Others argued that running would anger the serpent further, bringing floods to follow them. The priests insisted on offerings. Goats were tethered at the banks, garlands thrown into the current, bowls of milk poured until the river turned pale. Yet the water only rose higher, carrying the bodies of the goats downstream, untouched, as if mocking their devotion. It was then that a fisherman spoke of what he had seen. Alone on the water, he watched a head rise from the depths, a serpent's skull broader than his boat, jeweled eyes glowing red in the moonlight. He dropped his nets, he said, and paddled back with hands that shook until they bled. But the serpent followed, circling his boat, hissing so loudly that his ears still rang days later. Only when he leapt into the shallows and swam ashore did the water calm behind him. He swore the serpent's eyes had looked not at his body, but into his soul. Warnings echoed louder now. Old stories returned to life. The Naga did not want animals. The Naga did not want garlands or milk. They wanted what had always been promised, a bride, a life bound to the river, flesh and spirit offered whole. Without it, the floods would not stop. The villagers watched the current swirl and churn, listening to the hiss that rose with every dusk. They knew the old bargains had been broken too long, and the river had not forgotten. The night of reckoning came when the river claimed the village itself. Rain had not fallen for weeks, yet the current surged as though driven by a storm unseen. Huts nearest the bank were torn apart, their thatched roofs carried into the black water. Families screamed and clutched their children as the earth beneath their feet dissolved into mud. Torches sputtered and died in the damp wind, leaving only the glow of the swollen current. At the edge of the flood, the priests gathered with trembling hands. They carried garlands, bowls of ghee, and the body of a white goat, its throat already slit, blood still dripping warm. They chanted, their voices breaking, but the river gave no answer. Instead, a hiss split the night, so vast and resonant it seemed to rise from the earth itself. The water bulged, rising in a mound, and then parted. What came forth silenced even the screams. A serpent's head emerged, broader than the temple steps, crowned with scales that glistened like wet bronze. Its eyes were twin lanterns, red and merciless. Coils unfurled behind it, so massive they blotted out the moon, wrapping the riverbank in shadow. The villagers fell to their knees. Some wailed prayers, others pressed their faces into the mud, unwilling to look upon it. At the serpent's feet, if serpents can be said to have feet, the water churned. The missing girl rose there, or something that wore her shape. Her skin was pale, her eyes empty, her hair drifting as if still underwater. She opened her mouth and hissed in perfect echo to the Naga, a sound not human, not alive. Mothers clutched their children tighter, horrified to see what the sacrifice had become. The priests tried to step forward, but the ground shook and split, sending them sprawling. The serpent leaned closer, tongue tasting the air, tasting them. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice inside their skulls, wet, cold, and endless. More. The river surged, sweeping huts into its belly, dragging shrieking villagers beneath the surface. Men fought the current, clawing for higher ground, but the water followed, rising faster than their feet could carry them. The serpent's coils lashed, toppling trees, crushing walls. Everywhere, the sound of drowning filled the night. In that moment, it became clear. The Naga was no guardian, no protector of rivers. It was hunger given form, and its feast had begun. By dawn, the village was gone. Where homes once stood, there was only water, still and black, reflecting the pale morning sky. The survivors huddled on the hilltop, their eyes hollow, their clothes clinging with mud. They did not speak. They only watched the current below, waiting for the next surge. But the river lay quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. When the priests dared approach the bank, they found no bodies, no wreckage of huts, not even the carcasses of cattle. Everything the flood had swallowed was gone. The only sign was a trail of scales pressed deep into the mud, each one the size of a shield, leading back into the water. Whispers grew in the silence. Some claimed they saw the missing girl standing far downstream, draped in red, her anklets jingling faintly before she stepped into the current and vanished. Others swore that at night, in the lull between crickets, they could hear singing from beneath the river, voices of women calling in tones both beautiful and hollow, brides taken long ago, still bound in the coils of the serpent. The rituals changed after that. No longer just milk or incense. Now villagers returned to the old ways, the forbidden ones. A bride was chosen each season, led to the bank in silence, her eyes rimmed with kohl, her wrists heavy with bangles. She would vanish into the current, and the floods would not return for a time. Everyone knew what it meant, but no one dared refuse. Better one life than an entire village drowned. The priests gave it new names: devotion, appeasement, tradition, but the people knew. They whispered the truth in their huts, in their fields, to their children when the rains came heavy. The Naga had not been worshipped out of love, nor even respect, only fear. And the fear was earned. Because the river was no longer just water, it was alive, always listening, always waiting. And when its hunger rose, there was no wall high enough, no chant strong enough, no sacrifice great enough to keep it satisfied forever. The story of the drowning serpents lingers like mist on the riverbanks. Generations passed, yet the fear never left. Even now, villagers pour milk into snake holes, press flowers onto the current, and light incense at the water's edge. Not because they believe in blessings, but because they remember what silence costs. Travelers tell of rivers that shift in the night, currents pulling against the moon, as though something vast coils just beneath. Fishermen whisper of scales glimpsed in torchlight, larger than any boat, slipping back into the depths. And some, with voices lowered, speak of brides who still appear at the surface, their faces pale and empty, their bangles chiming faintly before the water swallows them again. The priests recite prayers and call it devotion, but the villagers know better. They know the river drinks. They know the Naga have not left. They know that every offering, every whispered chant, is not an act of worship, but a bribe. And still the question claws at their silence. How long until the river rises again? How long until the serpents coil tighter and demand more than brides, more than garlands, more than blood? Because the Naga are never gone. They are still there, watching from beneath the surface. And sooner or later, the waters will come for them all. Thank you. Now we rise from the rivers of Southeast Asia and step into the storms of Japan. There are 3 stories tonight, and what you have just heard is only the third. The Naga remind us that water is never innocent, that it can feed as easily as it can drown. But water is not the only element that carries hunger. In Japan, it is the thunder itself that once carried teeth. The god is called Raijin. Today he is painted as a playful figure, a stormbringer who beats on great drums across the sky. Children know him from cartoons, smiling and fierce. But the older tales are darker. They speak of Raijin not only as the god of thunder, but as a corpse-eater, a demon who descended with the lightning, ripping open the stomachs of the dead, gnawing until only husks remained. Families once trembled when the storms came. They placed offerings of rice and sweets at their doors, not for blessings, but for survival. Parents whispered to their children not to sleep too close to windows, lest Raijin see them and strike them where they lay. So, let us leave the drowned villages behind and follow the rolling thunder into the night. This is the story of the corpse-eating storm god. Raijin's image is everywhere in Japan. Bright and bold, painted across temple gates and festival banners, his round belly and fierce snarl ringed with drums. To modernize, he is a mascot of thunder, a force of nature tamed into art. Children laugh when they see him, even play games where they clap their hands to mimic his storms. But peel back the bright paint, and the older Raijin emerges, a god not of play, but of terror. The old myths say Raijin prowled the skies in search of corpses. When lightning split the night, it was his descent, teeth bared, claws reaching. He would rip open the bellies of the dead, feasting on livers and stomachs, gnawing until the remains were hollow. Thunder was not only sound, it was chewing, cracking, the rhythm of a god feeding on flesh. To be caught unprotected in such a storm was to risk becoming his next meal. This is why shrines to Raijin stood at village edges, where rice fields met the sky. Offerings were left not to invite blessing, but to ward him off. Bowls of rice, sweets pressed with careful hands, sometimes even the sacrifice of a small animal, each laid in hope that the thunder would pass without striking. Parents warned their children never to point at the sky during a storm, for Raijin might notice them and hurl a bolt in anger. Doors and shutters were sealed tight, straw charms tied to eaves, prayers whispered beneath rattling beams. Every flash of lightning was a reminder that the corpse-eater roamed above. The setting for his worship was never gentle. Shrines dedicated to him often stood exposed, their wooden gates rattling in mountain winds, their offerings soaked by sudden rain. Travelers approaching these places told of the air shifting, heavy with the smell of ozone and smoke, as if the storm never fully left. Villagers carried deep respect for such shrines, but it was respect carved from fear. Even as Buddhism softened his image, turning Raijin into a guardian of temples and protector of the Dharma, the unease remained. Storms were too violent, too sudden to belong entirely to a friendly god. Lightning struck fields, burned homes, and killed without warning. Each strike was seen as his bite, each rolling thunder as his laughter. To live under Raijin's sky was to balance reverence with terror. He was not prayed to out of love, nor even out of trust. He was honored so that he might look the other way, passing over the home, the field, the sleeping child. For, in the old belief, every storm brought with it the possibility that Raijin might descend, teeth bared, stomach growling, hungry for the dead. It began with a storm that would not end. The sky over the village turned black, roiling with clouds that split open again and again with white fire. For 3 nights and days, the thunder never ceased. Windows rattled, beams groaned, and the people huddled together in silence, clutching charms of straw and paper, whispering prayers with dry mouths. The priests said it was Raijin, prowling above, searching for the unguarded dead. On the second night, the graveyard flooded. Rain poured so heavily that the earth gave way, and old coffins shifted, rising half out of the mud. Families rushed to protect their ancestors' remains, but lightning struck so close the ground shook underfoot. When they returned at dawn, the coffins were empty. Not washed away, not broken open, emptied, as if hands had reached in and taken the bodies one by one. The villagers tried to bury their fear in ritual. Offerings of rice and sweets lined the shrine steps. Incense burned in frantic plumes, but the smoke only drifted sideways, torn by the storm. A boy swore he saw something crouched on the shrine roof, a figure round, bellied and snarling, with claws glinting in the flashes of lightning. He said its mouth moved in rhythm with the thunder, each roll a chew, each crack a swallow. By the third night, the fear spread beyond the graveyard. Chickens and dogs went missing, their bones later found gnawed clean near the riverbank. A farmer's child vanished after a bolt struck their home. Only ash and a small handprint burned into the tatami mat remained. People whispered that Raijin had grown bold, that corpses no longer sated him. Now he sought the living. When the thunder boomed directly overhead, The people covered their stomachs with futons, cloth, anything to hide their bellies. The elders warned that Raijin would strike there first, ripping the abdomen open to devour the organs within. Mothers pressed their palms over their children's bellies, trembling as each flash turned night into day. They did not sleep. They listened to the chewing in the sky, to the low growl of a god who had not finished feeding. The storm showed no mercy, and every soul in the village began to wonder, who would Raijin claim next? The fear deepened when the storm spread beyond the village. Travelers arrived from neighboring towns with the same stories. Coffins emptied, bones scattered, livestock gutted beneath the open sky. Some claimed they had seen the god himself descending with the lightning, a hulking figure wrapped in black clouds, his belly glowing faintly from within, as if fire burned through the skin. His hands clutched great drums, and each strike sent thunder rolling across the land. But the villagers knew the drums were not only for noise. They were the rhythm of his hunger, the beat of jaws gnawing through flesh. On the fourth night, a widow sat alone in her house, the storm raging overhead. Her husband had died weeks before, and his body rested in the graveyard that was now little more than mud. She whispered prayers, but the wind tore her words away. Then she heard it, a thump, steady and heavy, not on the roof, but from the ground beneath her. She looked down to see the floorboards trembling, as though something crawled in the earth below. She fled into the rain, crying for help, but the thunder swallowed her voice. Lightning split the sky, and in its light she saw him. Raijin crouched atop the shrine gate, his mouth wide, his tongue lashing. The widow dropped to her knees, pressing her hands to her stomach, whispering, "Please not me, please not me." But the god's eyes glowed white, and the next flash revealed her body sprawled lifeless in the mud. The priests tried to intervene. They gathered at the shrine, striking bells, chanting mantras, waving paper charms into the storm. But their voices faltered as the thunder grew louder. The charms disintegrated in their hands, burned away by unseen sparks. One priest was thrown back as lightning struck the altar, his body blackened in an instant. The others fled, abandoning their posts, knowing no chant could silence Raijin's appetite. The people turned desperate. Families placed their dead inside their homes, covering them with straw mats, hoping to hide them from the corpse-eater's gaze. Others dug shallow pits indoors, burying bodies beneath the floor, praying that thunder would not pierce their roofs. But still, the sounds came, gnawing, ripping, the low crunch that seemed to echo in their very bones. Children whispered of clawed hands scratching at their shutters, of a round shadow flickering on the walls during lightning's flash. Parents silenced them quickly, too afraid to listen. For everyone in the village already knew, Raijin was circling closer, hungrier, waiting for the next corpse, or the next body he might turn into one. It was on the fifth night that the storm reached its breaking point. The sky cracked open with a sound like the tearing of the earth itself, and the lightning came so fast it never allowed the dark to return. The village lay frozen in white flashes, every shadow etched sharp against the walls. In that endless light, they saw him clearly at last. Raijin descended with the thunder. His body was massive, swollen, his skin the color of storm clouds. Around his shoulders hung a ring of drums, each one struck by claws that split the air with every roll. But the sound was not only thunder, it was chewing, tearing, the rhythm of bones splitting in his jaws. His eyes glowed white, his grin stretched wide, and from his mouth hung strips of flesh that steamed in the rain. The villagers scattered. Some fled into the forest, stumbling through mud as trees cracked like kindling under lightning strikes. Others fell prostrate in the streets, pressing their faces into the earth, offering themselves before he could take their children. But Raijin ignored their prayers. He moved toward the graveyard, the swamp of coffins now collapsed into muck. With a howl that shook the sky, he plunged his claws into the mud and dragged free what lay beneath. Witnesses swore they saw him lift corpses in both hands, ripping them open with casual hunger. Stomachs split, ribs shattered, organs devoured in mouthfuls. Each flash of lightning showed the grotesque feast, the bellies of the dead gnawed empty, their husks tossed aside into the rising water. The thunder roared with every bite, a drumbeat of his endless appetite. But soon the graveyard gave out. There were no more corpses left to claim. That was when the lightning struck the village itself. Roofs splintered, homes caught fire even in the rain. One by one the villagers were dragged from their shelters, not by hands but by the storm itself, hurled into the mud where Raijin's shadow loomed. Mothers clutched their children tight, only to see them snatched away by bolts that split the sky. And through it all came his laughter, a booming, hollow sound that mixed with thunder until the two were indistinguishable. Witnesses said the earth itself shook with his mirth as he feasted not only on the dead, but on the living, ripping them open, feeding in frenzy. That night, the storm did not simply pass over the village. It consumed it. By dawn, only smoldering ruins remained, and the fields lay strewn with husks that no one dared to touch. The thunder god had fed, and his hunger had no end. When the storm finally broke, the silence was worse than the thunder. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the clouds rolled back, and for the first time in nearly a week the sky showed pale with dawn. But the village no longer stood. Roofs had collapsed into ash, fields were gouged with black scars, and the air reeked of smoke and rot. The survivors, those few who had hidden in the hills, did not cheer. They only stared at the ruin below, afraid that the silence was just another trick. When they dared return, they found the graveyard a wasteland of hollowed husks. Bodies lay split open, ribs cracked wide, stomachs gnawed clean. No animals circled the remains. Not even crows dared approach. The villagers wept, but they wept quietly, too afraid the sound might call him back. In the shrine at the edge of town, the drums still trembled. No hands struck them. Yet they quivered faintly as though the echo of his feast had not ended. A priest pressed his ear against the wood and swore he heard chewing inside, steady and wet, as if Raijin had left pieces behind to gnaw at the living world. He fled that same day and never returned. The elders whispered the truth the people did not want to hear. Offerings were not protection. Prayers were not shield. Raijin was not a god to be placated. He was a hunger without mercy, a storm that fed and fed until nothing remained. The bright depictions painted on temple walls, the festivals with their playful drums, these were disguises, masks painted by time to soften a terror that once prowled openly in the sky. Even now, when lightning rips across Japan, mothers tell their children to cover their stomachs with blankets. They clap their hands in rhythm, pretending the thunder is only drums. But beneath the comfort lingers unease. They remember the older stories, the ones whispered in the dark, that Raijin does not leave when the clouds clear. He only waits, circling above, forever hungry for the next corpse, the next storm. The silence after thunder is never safety. It is the pause between bites. The storm passed, the tale ended, but the dread remains. Tonight we have walked through 3 worlds of terror. Kali, the blood-drinking mother who stood upon corpses. The Yoginis, 64 sisters who danced in circles of flesh and shadow. And the Naga, serpents who rose from rivers to claim brides and whole villages. And finally Raijin, the thunder god whose feast was carved into the stomachs of the dead. 3 stories, but one truth. Worship is not always born of love. Sometimes it is born of fear, of bargains struck with forces that cannot be controlled. Offerings of milk, flowers, blood, or flesh were never gifts. They were payments. And those who stopped paying always discovered what it meant to be remembered by the gods. The idols may fade, the temples may crumble, the myths may soften. In tonight's episode, we are traveling into the heart of India, where devotion and dread have always walked side by side. There are 3 stories tonight, and this is one of them. This one is whispered in temples, in villages, and even in city streets, where her image is painted on cracked walls and clay idols. Everyone knows her name. Everyone fears her shadow. She is called Kali. To some, the protective mother. To others, the blood drinker. Black-skinned, with eyes that blaze like fire. Her garland is not of flowers but of severed heads,